Buenos días, buenas tardes,
Good
buenas
morning, good
noches,
afternoon, good
donde quiera que
evening,
ustedes estén.
wherever you might find
Les
yourself in.
damos la bienvenida
We are
a
welcoming
este
you
espacio
to
de
this space,
conversación
this conversation
que
space
estamos teniendo un
that
día
we
muy
are
especial
having
en el
on a
Día
very special
Internacional
day
de los
during the
Derechos de los
International
Migrantes.
Day of
Welcome
International
everyone.
Migrant
Good
Rights Day.
morning, good
Welcome,
evening, good
everybody.
afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this very special event that we are convening today on the International Human Rights Day of Migrants. This is going to be a conversation that is going to take place in Spanish. So if you need interpretation, please make sure to find the global icon on the bottom of your screen and then choose English as your channel so that you can follow us in this conversation. Bueno, voy a pasar a español. I'm going to continue and this conversation will all take place in Spanish. So just make sure of that and we will remind periodically on the chat for those who may join later.
Pues.
Bueno, soy Elena Olea,
I
vicedirectora de
am
Alianza
Elena
Américas.
Olea, Vice Director
Bienvenidos.
of
Nos da
Alianza
muchísimo
Americas.
gusto
Welcome. We are
tener
very
este evento
pleased
el día
to
de hoy.
have you here during
Eh,
today's event.
Lamentablemente, el trabajo en
Unfortunately,
materia de los
the
derechos humanos de
work
las
when
personas
it comes
migrantes
to
ha
the human rights
cambiado
of migrant
drásticamente
people
en los
has
últimos años
changed
y ha
drastically during the last
cambiado
several years,
como
and it
resultado
has
de las
changed
políticas que
as a
estamos viendo que
result
están
of the
implementando los
policies
estados
that
contra
we
las
are
personas
seeing that the
migrantes.
states are
Hace
implementing
algunos
against migrant
años
people. Some years
teníamos
ago,
otros desafíos y era
we
urgente
had
insistir, por
other
ejemplo, en la
challenges, and it
regularización
was
migratoria como un tema
time to
central.
insist on migratory regularization as a
Pero es importante reconocer que
central
en este
issue.
momento
But it is
de
important to
retrocesos en
recognize
materia de derechos
that
humanos en
during these
diversos
times
lugares
of
y
delays and
también
setbacks when it comes
de,
to human rights
perdón,
matters,
de exacerbación
my
de la xenofobia
apologies, and exacerbation of
y de
xenophobia
demonización de las personas
and
migrantes,
demonization
las
of migrant
violaciones de
people,
derechos
the
humanos que
violations
sufren
of
las
human
personas que en
rights
situaciones de
suffered
movilidad
by people
han
who are
cambiado.
in human mobility have
Hay sin
changed.
duda un
Without a
hecho que
doubt,
marca
there is a fact
el año
that
2025 en las
marks the
Américas en
year
materia de migración.
2025
Y aunque los
in
flujos de
Americas
personas
when it comes to
continúan,
migration,
aunque
and
los
even if the
desafíos en
flow
materia de
of people
protección
continues,
internacional
even if the
siguen siendo
challenges in
muchos,
international
y
protection
aunque
continue
vemos
to be
cada
numerous,
vez
and even if you continue
las
seeing
oportunidades de
that
encontrar
the
protección internacional
opportunities to find
son
international
menos y
protection
más
are
ineficientes,
fewer
tal
and
vez
less
lo más
efficient,
dramático que pasó en las
what might
Américas
be
en el
most dramatic that's
2025
happening to
fue la
people throughout the
situación
Americas in
con las
2025
personas
has been the
venezolanas
situation with
detenidas
Venezuelan
en
people
Estados
who
Unidos
were
y fueron
detained in the
deportadas
United
a El
States
Salvador
and
y
then
las
deported
condiciones de
to El
detención que
Salvador
sufrieron
and the
en esa nación.
conditions of the
Y
detention
es
that they
por
were
eso
suffering in
que
that
nos
country.
parece
And this is
absolutamente
why
central
we
que
feel it
hoy
is
tomemos una
absolutely
pausa
crucial that we take
para
a pause
reflexionar sobre este
to
hecho,
reflect on this
para
fact in
conocer e
order
informarnos mejor
to
sobre lo que pasó,
get to
pero
know
también
and be
para
more
pensar
informed of what has
en qué
happened,
son
but also to think
los cambios
about
que es
what are
necesario
the
hacer
changes
para que
that
este
are
evento no se
necessary
vuelva a
to
repetir.
carry out
Y
in order to
también,
make
por
sure that this does
supuesto,
not
cuáles
happen
son
again.
las
And of
reparaciones que
course,
las
what are
personas
the
que sufrieron
reparations
estas
that the
graves
people who
violaciones a sus
suffered
derechos
these severe
humanos
violations to the
necesitan y
human
merecen
rights
recibir.
require and
Y es por eso que
deserve
en este marco
to
es para
receive?
nosotros
And this
un
is why,
verdadero honor
within all of this,
estar
it is
hoy
an
aquí
honor to have
con
with us today
dos personas que
with
trabajan
two
en el
people
ámbito de los derechos
who
humanos,
work
eh,
in human rights
que
field,
lo hacen,
who
digamos, con
do
muchísima
so with
intensidad y
a lot
pasión.
of
Es muy bonito
intensity
estar
and
en este
passion. It
día
is very nice to
teniendo este
be
gusto.
in the
Nos
state having this
acompañan
event.
hoy René
We are
Valiente,
accompanied
es
today
un
by
abogado
René
salvadoreño
Valiente. He's an El
egresado de la
Salvadorian
Universidad
lawyer,
Centroamericana José
graduated from
Simeón
the Universidad
Cañas de la
Centroamericana
UCA.
José Simeón
René tiene una
Cañas, UCA.
maestría en Derecho
René holds a
Constitucional
master's
y es
degree in
candidato a
constitutional
doctor
criminal
en
law
ciencias
and is currently a
sociales.
PhD
René tiene
candidate
una
in
amplia
social
trayectoria de
sciences.
trabajo
He
tanto
has
dentro
a
del
great
sistema de
trajectory
administración de
working
justicia
whether in
como
justice administration
eh,
as well as
experto, por ejemplo, del
he's an
programa de la
expert
Oficina de
on
Naciones Unidas
the
contra la Droga y el
UN
Delito,
Office, United
pero
Nations
también ha
Office on
trabajado en la
Drugs and
sociedad civil.
Crime, but has also worked in civil society. And at this moment, he is a research director at Cristosal. And it's important to remind that for those of you who don't know, Cristosal is a human rights organization that was founded and functioned from El Salvador, but also had vocation to work throughout Central America. And that because of the oppression candidates occurrences in the country, it has been forced to shut down operations to stop functioning from El Salvador and is now doing so from Guatemala. So you have to recognize the courage and solidarity and the difficult situations that Cristosal is going through. René, thank you very much for being with us here today. It is truly a privilege. Thank you very much. It is an honor to share with you as well this day. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Juan Papier. Juan Papier works at Human Rights Watch, is an international organization that works in human rights with a great and long trajectory at a global level, but with an important advocacy in Latin America. The work in America of Human Rights Watch is very, and Weiss is also the vice director of the Latin American section. Juan is also a lawyer from Argentina. He was formed in Argentina and also with formation in human rights in Geneva. Juan, thank you very much for being us here today, which I imagine has been a long day for you. Thank you very much, Elena and Alianza Americas, for the invitation. It is an honor. I am truly grateful. Thank you. The idea that we want in this conversation here with all of you is to talk about this report that you prepared together, a report on human rights. But I think that a crucial part of this conversation is to start from explaining what is a human rights report, why it's done, what is it done for, how is it done. So if you agree, let's begin there. René, would you like to start, or Juan? Who wants to begin? René, go ahead. Very well. Well, why is it important to document to what happens in human rights? There are many ways to respond to this, but I think that what's most important is to highlight that behind every report, behind every study and analysis, there are human beings who have seen with their own eyes how their human rights have been affected in diverse ways. And it's important to understand that one of the main works when it comes to defending human rights by making these reports is to vindicate the rights of the victims who have been affected in different ways by the states. In this particular case, we have 252 young adults and from Venezuela who have been sent to Secot in El Salvador, but behind all of this, throughout the time that they were sent there, they were suffered physically, also suffered psychological attacks. It was a very deep process of stigmatization and prestige from two states acting in coordinated fashion, which definitely affected their lives. And behind the reports and what has been published in the recommendations made to the states, we have to understand that they are the victims, and the victims are the focus of the work in human rights. People have the right to recognize that they have suffered unfair attacks, they have suffered damage to their rights, that they have been victims of actions and abuse from the state. And at the same time, it's important that we are all aware of the necessity of the university universal respect to people's rights when people are treated that way, and there are people who tolerate it or allow it or ignore it, it opens a space to these abuses of power. This is why it's important that we do the work that we do to raise awareness, not only in the states who are directly responsible for this, but also in the population, that attacking a person who find themselves in a vulnerable situation is something that should worry each and every one of us. That trampling the human rights of a migrant person, because seeing as today we're celebrating the International Day of Migrants' Rights, it should not be a reason for, what should be a reason for generalized concern when it's about attacking human rights. If we don't act, if we do not denounce, if we do not highlight what's happening, then all of us are at risk that we will be victims of attack, because that's what they are. They are attacks on humanity as a whole.
Juan, en la experiencia de
Juan,
Human Rights Watch,
in based on the
¿quién es la
experience of
audiencia de
Human
los
Rights
reports
Watch, who is
y qué
the
pasa
audience
con
who
ellos?
receives this? What happens to one of these
Gracias.
reports? Thank you.
Mira, nosotros en Human Rights Watch
Here
somos
at
una
Human
organización
Rights
que
Watch,
se
it's
crea
an
y
organization that is
trabaja
created
con la
and
idea
works with the idea
de que el
that
naming and shaming ayuda
the
a proteger
naming
los
and
derechos humanos.
shaming
Es decir,
helps
que esta idea de
protecting human
documentar
rights,
violaciones de
that
derechos
this
humanos y
idea of
quiénes son
documenting
responsables
human rights abuse and saying who's
sirve
responsible
para
serves
prevenir
to
futuros abusos y para
prevent
garantizar
future
justicia.
abuses and to guarantee justice.
Esa idea, por supuesto, no
This
la
idea, of
asumimos
course, we don't assume it or take
con la forma inocente de
on
una
in
isla.
an innocent
Creemos
way.
que detrás de cada uno de
We
estos
believe
informes
that behind all of these
hay que tener
reports,
hechos rigurosos, como
we
el
have to
informe
have
crítico
rigorous facts as
y
the
el
ones
informe
included in
riguroso,
this
pero además
report.
hay que tener una
But
estrategia de
besides
incidencia y
this, we have to
comunicación
have a communication and
muy atinada para cada uno de estos
advocacy
reportes.
strategy that's well thought for each
Con este
report. In
informe
order
que
to
hicimos
achieve
conjuntamente con
changes, we
Cristosal,
did it together with Cristosal.
lo que queremos es
What we
exponer la
want to
realidad de
achieve
nuestra
is to
experiencia en
expose the
Secot
reality of what these people suffer in
frente
Secot
a diversos
in
foros,
light of,
primero frente,
for,
yo
in front
diría,
of
frente a
diverse
tribunales de Estados
audiences.
Unidos. Creo que
First,
esto es
the American
fundamental
courtrooms. I
para que
think
se
this is
empiecen a tomar acciones
fundamental
para
so that
frenar
actions
o
start to be
limitar
taken to
procesos abusivos
stop
como
or
el que
limit
en este caso de Secot.
abusive deportations,
Entendiendo
such
que
as
esta no es la
these to
única, el único
Secot.
caso de
We
deportación masiva
understand
que
that
ocurrió
this is not the
recientemente,
only
pero
case
probablemente
of
sean los más
abusive
grandes ocurridos
deportations,
ahora
but it
mismo
might be the most
desde que asumió
severe
Trump el 8 de
since
octubre.
that has taken up to date
Además,
since
creemos que es
Trump assumed
importante
power again. We
dirigir
also
este
feel
informe al
it's important
Congreso de los
to
Estados
address
Unidos
this report
para que
to the US
compartan algún
Congress so that
tipo
where there's
de
a favorable political climate,
para
they
investigar
know they take
y para
measures
que
to
puedan limitar
investigate
los
these
usos
acts
irracionales de fondos por
and
parte de la
to
organización
limit
para
the use of
pagarle a
reducing
gobiernos para
funds
cometer
in order
delitos de derechos humanos, como ocurrió
to
en este
stop
caso,
paying governments who commit
cuando
these types of human rights
se pagó
violations. Like, for
$4,7 millones a la
example,
organización de Bukele
when
para
the Trump
entrenar a
administration
policías
paid
para
millions
actuar
of
en el
dollars
país.
to
Y además es
Bukele
importante que el
to commit these
público en
acts,
general
it's also
conozca
important that the general
sobre estas violaciones
audience
de derechos
knows about
humanos,
these violations, human rights
porque
violations,
todos los
because
gobiernos
all of the governments,
intentan dar la impresión de
they
alguna
try to
forma u
give the
otra de que tienen un
impression in one way or
compromiso
another that they have a commitment
con acuerdos básicos, con un
with
tratamiento
basic
básico a todos los
agreements,
seres
with
humanos,
basic treatment to
y
other
tenemos que
human
mostrar
beings.
que
And we
estas
have to
violaciones
show
graves de
that
derechos humanos han
these
ocurrido. Tenemos que
severe human
exponer
rights
lo que
violations have
significa
taken
el
place.
modelo
We have to
Bukele en
expose
América
what the
Latina, porque ese
Bukele
modelo no es un
model
modelo de
means in Latin
respuesta, es
America
un modelo de
and
represión.
why it's not a favorable model. Instead, it's one of
Creo que es
oppression and
importante que
abuse. And
toda la
this is why I
región,
think it's important
incluyendo El
that the
Salvador,
entire region,
conozcan este
including
informe
El
y puedan
Salvador,
intervenir en Secot.
about these atrocities taking place in Secot.
Gracias. Yo creo que
Thank
es un buen punto
you,
para
Juan. I
empezar.
think that's a very
Quiero
good point
invitar a la
to begin.
audiencia
I want
a que
to
se sienta
invite the
cómoda
audience to
participando,
feel comfortable in
a que nos
participating,
vaya,
that
digamos, poniendo sus preguntas en el chat,
to placing
de
your
manera que
questions in the
esta
chat so that
conversación
this
los incluya
conversation,
desde el primer
it,
momento.
you are part of this
René, ¿nos
conversation from
puedes
the very
contar
first
un poco
moment.
cuál
Rene,
fue
can you
la
tell us a
metodología
bit
que
about
utilizaron
what the
y cómo
methodology
hicieron este
was that you
informe?
used, how you prepared this report? Well, from the moment that in between March and April of this year, they made public that these people were going to be sent to the El Salvadorian jail system, in Cristosal, we established a communication mechanism we established an online platform that allowed us to establish contact with relatives, and this led us to carrying out interviews to document the backgrounds of these people, whether in Venezuela or the countries that they had transited from. And initially, we did it with the purpose of providing support and counseling to the families, as well as we've done to the El Salvadorian families who are victims of the Bukele's regime. This led to the organization's legal team led by Ruth Lopez, our colleague, who's currently a political prisoner of the Bukele regime. Ruth's team and she directly, they presented 70 habeas corpus lawsuits representing the relatives of these men who were sent to Secot to demand the Supreme Court of Justice to set these people free. After this, we started to document the cases through interviews and collecting this data. And fortunately, the people were set free between that exchange that took place between the US and Venezuela. And this allowed, through the context that we had already created before, in collaboration with Human Rights Watch, to implement a more profound investigation process that included the interviews to the relatives and 40 of these people who were directly affected by this process, besides the consultation with other independent sources that has allowed us to confirm the situation that took place. The report is based on direct testimony of people who have been affected and relatives of people who have been affected, and it has been built starting from the victims themselves, and it directly reflects the affectations they suffered within the El Salvadorian jail system.
Bueno, y en ese punto en
Well,
particular,
and in that
ustedes presentaron esos
particular
recursos de
point,
habeas
you
corpus.
presented these
Como,
habeas
y es
corpus
bueno recordar a todas las personas que
recourses,
el
and
recurso
it's
de habeas corpus
important
es un
to
recurso
mention that
realmente
habeas
muy
corpus
simple
is
en que
essentially
básicamente
very
está
simple,
cuestionando cuáles son
where
los
it's
motivos por
basically
los cuales una
questioning
persona
what are
está
the reasons
privada de
why a
libertad.
person is
¿Qué
being
respuesta obtuvieron a esos recursos
detained, or
presentados, René?
what answer did you receive to these recourses? None. The state maintains silent with regards to the demands and lawsuits presented by the families. And it wasn't until these people were set free that the court started to reject these habeas corpus, seeing as how the situation had finalized, the situation that led to these habeas corpus being presented, and they did it without even confirming that the people were set free. In other words, the court, the constitutional chamber, they use as a that fact that publicly these people were set free in order to say that it's a notorious fact that they don't need proof that these people had been set free. However, there's no official list, and the Salvadorian state has never published a list or confirmed the identity of the people detained there. So the court, lacking in their due diligence, has not actually reconfirmed that these people were set free. Fortunately, since we know these cases and have had contact with families or relatives, we know that the people have been set free. It's not the courts who have done this, but the response was no, there was no possibility, not only to the habeas corpus, but also to the direct requirements from the relatives who went to El Salvador and wanted to exercise their right to visit their relatives and lawyers who had been detained, and they received the same response: total silence from the institutions.
Gracias, René.
Thank
Juan,
you,
en
Rene.
el contexto
Juan,
de
within the
América
context
y
of
de la
America
historia de
and
violación de derechos
the
humanos,
story of human rights
¿cómo, digamos,
violations,
esta primera situación de
how
no
this
resolver los
first
recursos de habeas
situation
corpus, que además
of
es un
not
recurso tradicionalmente
resolving or
expedito y
responding to the
resulta como
habeas
ridículo
corpus, which in theory
que le respondan
is
en este momento?
relatively a quick procedure, so it's
¿Cómo
ridiculous if you
entienden
don't
ustedes
respond.
o cómo asemejan la situación,
How do you
esta
deal
situación en
with the
particular en El
situation, this
Salvador,
particular
con otras
situation
situaciones
in El Salvador compared to other experiences that you've seen
Nosotros
throughout
concluimos que los
America?
venezolanos
We
enviados a El
concluded
Salvador
that the
fueron víctimas de
Venezuelans sent
desaparición
to
forzada
El Salvador were victims of
y
forced
usamos el
disappearance.
término desaparición forzada
And we use the
estrictamente en el sentido
term
legal,
forced
no en un
disappearance in the
sentido
legal
político
sense,
o con la
not in a
intención
political
de
sense or with a
exagerar, de
purpose
nada. Esto
of.
es en sentido estrictamente
This is
legal
strictly a legal
con la
sense
definición del derecho
that
internacional
complies with the
de desaparición forzada.
international definition
Estas
of
personas
a
fueron víctimas de
forced
detención forzada
disappearance.
porque
These
se los
people
privó
were
de la
victims
libertad,
of this because they
se
were
les negó la
denied of their
información a sus
freedom
familiares
and
sobre
the
el paradero de
information
sus
was
restantes.
denied to the
La
relatives
responsabilidad
regarding
por estos
the
hechos
whereabouts
recae
of
en el
these
gobierno de El
people.
Salvador, pero
The
también en el gobierno
responsibility
de El
lies
Salvador.
within the El Salvadorian
Hemos
and United
comentado
States
que, como
governments. We
señalaba René,
documented,
no
just like
respondíamos por
René
el habeas
mentioned,
corpus, pero
they
además el
didn't
gobierno de El
respond
Salvador
to
se
the
negó a
habeas
proporcionar
corpus
información
applications,
de
but they
los agentes de
also
ICE
rejected providing any
también se negaron
information, and
constantemente a dar la
the ICE
información a los
agents
familiares de quienes resulta sobre los
constantly
paraderos de
denied
ellos.
giving information to
Lo que
relatives
mencionas
regarding the whereabouts of
específicamente
their
sobre
people
los
who are
habeas
being
corpus
detained.
creo que es
With regards specifically to the habeas
decir de
corpus,
la gravedad
it
de la
shows
situación de derechos humanos de El
the
Salvador,
grave situation regarding
porque
human
el
rights
habeas corpus
situation in
fue
El
el
Salvador,
recurso
because
básico judicial que se
habeas
empleaba,
corpus
por
is the
ejemplo, en el Salvador y el
basic
Cono Sur
legal
para
application
intentar
used in the
conocer los
southern part
paraderos
of the world
por la
in
suerte
South
de las
America
personas que
to
estaban siendo
know
desaparecidas.
what was happening to the
Y ni
people
siquiera ese recurso tan
who
básico, tan
disappeared, and
sencillo,
not
es
even
una
something
garantía
so simple and so
esencial de
basic,
derechos
which is an
humanos
essential
respetada
guarantee with
dignidad. Aquí
regards to human
estamos
rights, was
ante
not
violaciones de
respected in
derechos
this
humanos
case.
de la
We
más
are
severa gravedad
seeing
que
the most
tristemente nos
severe types
recuerdan
of human rights
periodos
violations,
muy
which
oscuros
unfortunately
de
remind us of
la
very
situación de
dark
derechos humanos en
periods
América Latina.
of the human rights situation
Y
throughout
estas
Latin
violaciones de
America.
derechos humanos
And these are human
cometidas
rights
por El
violations
Salvador, pero
committed
con
by
complicidad
El
de la administración
Salvador
Trump.
with complicity from the Trump administration.
Gracias, Juan. René,
Thank
y haciendo un
you,
paralelo
Juan. And
con
in
el resto de
parallel
las personas que
to
están
the
privadas de
rest of the
libertad
people
bajo el
who
régimen
are
de excepción
detained
en El
under
Salvador,
the state of
¿nos
exception
puedes contar
in El
algo sobre
Salvador,
qué pasa
can
con
you
los
tell
recursos de habeas
us
corpus y
about
su
what
tratamiento
happens
para
to the
cuestionar
habeas
los
corpus
motivos de una
petitions
privación de
when
libertad
you
o
present them to
accesibilidad si
question the
tienen en sus
motives
casos a los
behind a
familiares
detention,
de ver el
or in
cuerpo de los
case
que
the
están privados de
families, when they
libertad?
want to see these relatives of theirs who are detained? To understand the scope and true dimension of what our Venezuelan brothers suffered in Secot, we have to understand the situation that El Salvador is going through. El Salvador has, it's about 3 years and 9 months under a state of exception or state of emergency, which, because due to the Constitution states it should not last more than 30 days. However, because since this regime has complete control over all institutions, there is no checks and balances for Bukele. It allows him to exercise this without interruption, violating essential constitutional rights such as the right to legal defense, legal representation, interfering or listening in on private conversation, communications. And this has meant that a an uncertain number, but somewhere between 88,000, 99,000 people are being processed they are being detained in El Salvador in a situation just like Juan mentioned, where they are victims of forced disappearance. They are they are completely unprotected by the law, without any communication and without any possibility to establish essential communication with their legal representation or relatives. And among these people, there's a large number of human rights defenders. There are land defenders, anti-corruption lawyers. They are political prisoners of this regime. The situation is that the Venezuelans who have told us about this are quite similar to what we documented throughout for the rest of the El Salvadorian jail system: torture, physical abuse. They are denied elemental access to elemental things, for example, clean water, food, sunlight. We've been able to document within the El Salvadorian jail system even over hundreds of people who have died, who are under the custody of the states, people who suffered physical aggressions or conditions that worsened because of the lack to because they didn't have access to proper meals, proper medications, people who have died because of the lack of medical care and serious diseases who that the authorities were aware of before they entered the jail system. So, and the state has not fulfilled its role of taking care of the people who are under their custody. The human rights situation in El Salvador for several years now is a very critical and serious situation, and this is why it becomes even worse that the jail system has been selected to send this message against migration. In other words, those who took the decision to use this system were fully aware of the situation and human rights violations that occur in El Salvador. Cristosal has denounced since 2022 these situations. We've documented the number that I mentioned of people who have passed away or died under custody of the state, and this issue has been taken by offices of the United States, for example, the Secretary of State, that has been reported throughout the years. It's a situation that they were fully aware of. And this is part of what we have to value when we understand the scope of this agreement between El Salvador and the US, that it has been deliberately and directly selected a system that consistently violates the human rights of people of those people that they torture and even kill. And they selected this system specifically in order to send a message against migration, a message of fear and hate.
Gracias, René.
Thank
Juan,
you,
¿cómo
Rene.
podemos entender, cómo
Juan,
puede
how can we
entender una persona
understand
hasta dónde
a
llega la responsabilidad
until
De
what is
Estados Unidos,
the
volviendo justamente
how far
a
reaching is
esto
the
subraya
responsibility of
René?
the
¿Esto
United
era con
States
conocimiento
to
más
what
que
Rene has
reconocimiento?
mentioned that
¿Cuáles eran
they
las
were
condiciones en
aware
las
of this,
cuales iban
not
a estar
that did not know
represando
the
las
current
personas que fueron
conditions the
deportadas
people were going to be
a El
subject to,
Salvador?
people that were being deported
Y
to El
dónde
Salvador.
empieza ya la
And
responsabilidad
where does
del
the
Salvador? Y creo
responsibility of
que
El
es
Salvador come into
importante
play? I think
entender
it's
este
important
elemento. ¿Cómo
to
lo explicarías tú,
understand
Juan?
this element. How would you
Bien.
explain
Bueno,
it?
aquí hay distintas
Well,
violaciones que hemos
here there are
documentado en
different
esta
violations that we've
detención.
documented in the
Hemos
report.
documentado
We've documented
desaparición forzada,
forced
detención
disappearances,
arbitraria,
arbitrary detention,
torturas y daños
torture,
crueles.
and cruel treatment.
Y la
And
violación a la obligación de
the
non-refoulement, es decir,
violation
la obligación de no
that
enviar personas a países en los que
the
están en riesgo de
obligation to
violación de
not
derechos humanos.
send people to places where their human rights are at
En cuanto
risk. When it
la
comes
revisión
to
del non-refoulement, el principal responsable es Estados Unidos por haber
the
enviado
United
a estas
States is
personas
primarily
a
responsible
sistemas
because they
penitenciarios, como
sent
mencionaba
these
René,
people to a jail system that, just like
Estados Unidos
René
sabía
mentioned,
que era un sistema
where
penitenciario
they
en el
were
cual se cometía la
completely
violación de derechos
aware of
humanos. Es
that
decir,
it was a
Estados
jail
Unidos
system
era
where
consciente
severe
de
human
que
rights
después de la
violations were
detención,
taking place.
de que era
They
muy
were
probable que estas
conscious that
personas
it was
sean
very likely that these
torturadas,
people were going to
maltratadas en
be
las cárceles de El
tortured
Salvador.
and
Esa
mistreated
es
in the
la
El
responsabilidad que recae en
Salvadorian
los Estados
jails.
Unidos.
So that's a responsibility that
En cuanto a
lies
la
with the
desaparición
US.
forzada, nosotros
With
creemos que
regards to
tanto Estados
forced
Unidos como El
disappearance, we
Salvador
believe
son
that both the
responsables
United States
porque,
and
como
El
mencioné,
Salvador are
hemos
responsible
documentado
because,
que
as I
tanto el
mentioned,
gobierno de El
we've
Salvador como el
documented that the El
FBI
Salvadorian
en
government and
reiteradas
ICE
ocasiones
agents
negaron
have
la conocer de estas
repeatedly
personas información sobre el
denied the
paradero real.
relatives
Y de hecho,
information regarding the whereabouts
tenemos
of
varios
the people
ejemplos
who are being
que se llaman
detained. We
transcripción
included
de las
several
llamadas
examples,
telefónicas de los
including
venezolanos que
transcriptions of the
desesperados
phone calls
llamaban
of these
no sé,
Venezuelan
noche
people
a
who
ICE para saber
desperately
dónde estaban sus
called night
familiares
and
y los
day
agentes de
asking
ICE
to know where their
constantemente
relatives
negaban
were,
esta información.
and they constantly denied
En cuanto a
or
la
they
detención
rejected giving this
arbitraria,
information. Regarding arbitrary
principalmente la
detention,
recae
I
en el
think
gobierno
the
salvadoreño. Es
responsibility
arbitrario porque
lies
carece de
in
cualquier
the
base
El
legal. El
Salvadorian
principio
government
básico de
because they lack
democracia para que una persona sea
any
privada de
legal
libertad
basis
tiene que haber,
for
entre
any
menos
people to
otros
be
requisitos,
detained. There should be,
una
at the
ley
very least,
obligatoria
among other requirements,
que
a law that
justifica la
states
privación de la libertad
why
que se puede
these
realizar.
people, why they can
Una
carry
base
out
legal
detaining people, a
es
legal basis, and
una
this
garantía
is
básica de
a
derechos
basic
humanos
guarantee for human
por lo menos del
rights,
siglo
at
XIX.
least during the 19th
Y eso
century.
no existió en este caso. No
This did not
conocemos ninguna
exist in
base
this
legal
case.
para tener
We don't know any legal basis to have these people detained in El Salvador, and the main responsibility lies in the Salvadorian government because of this arbitrary detention. And when it comes to torture, and later on we can talk more about these, the main responsibility, of course, is for the Salvadorian government, the state of El Salvador, with systematic torture that takes place against. Also, complicity from the government of the United States because they sent people to El Salvador knowing that they could be tortured when they were being detained in this jail. So there are different types of, different elements of, and different types of responsibility for both governments in all these types of acts. Thank you, Juan. I think that it's important to highlight these elements. Now,
¿nos podrían contar cuáles fueron esos
can
hallazgos más
you
importantes de estas entrevistas
about
que
the most
ustedes logran
important
hacer cuando las
elements of
personas
these
son
interviews that you
liberadas?
carry
Yo
out when these
quisiera
people
subrayar un
are set
elemento
free? And I would
que
like to
creo que es
highlight
central porque,
an
digamos,
element that I think it's
la mayoría
crucial
de
we
las
keep in
personas que han
mind.
sido
The
detenidas
majority of
en
people who have been
recepción
detained during
semicensuradas de
this
libertad,
state of exception
de manera que
are
no
still
sabemos lo que
detained, are
viven,
still
lo que están
jailed,
viviendo, lo
which
que
means
están
we don't know
sufriendo.
what they're
Y por eso
experiencing or suffering.
creo
And
que
this is
la
why I think
liberación de los
that
testimonios de estas
these
personas
people
son
being
una
set free and their
muy dolorosa
testimonies
ventana a lo que está
was a
ocurriendo
painful window
en
into what
los
was
centros de
happening
detención,
in
en las
these
prisiones en El
detention
Salvador.
centers in
Entonces,
the
por
El
eso, si nos
Salvadorian
pueden
jails.
contar, por
So,
favor, sobre lo
can
que
you
encontraron
tell
en
us
las
a bit
entrevistas.
about what you found in these interviews?
Adelante, Juan, si quieres
Yes.
Adelante, yo complemento.
Perfect. As I mentioned, we documented several violations of human rights, starting with forced disappearance and arbitrary detentions, where it's most important to focus on tortures. As Rene mentioned, we interviewed 40 Venezuelans who had been detained in Secot, and we could corroborate their allegations through forensic analysis. For example, we had photographs of the injuries that these people have on their bodies, and we asked the forensic expert to confirm what they were seeing, and open door analysis to know that the spaces that they described in Secot actually existed. And with all this, we could document multiple incidents of torture during these months that these people were detained in Secot. We documented that these people suffered beatings from during daily checks in their jail cells. They suffered beatings because they in Secot because they spoke out loud with another person who was detained, or for showering, or for bathing or showering in hours outside of what was allowed, and also beatings because requesting basic things. Apologies to the audio quality right now. We documented 4 specific moments where they suffered severe beatings. First, when they arrived Secot, when they were all beaten up in a brutal fashion. The second was during the visit of Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security. As you all know, she visited Secot. She a very famous video saying that any migrant that tried to illegally enter the United States would wind up in Secot. She recorded this video in front of some people who were detained, apparently some ex-gang members from El Salvador. But what we could collect from all these testimonies is that she first visited the jail cells where the Venezuelans. They screamed at her, "Freedom! We are not terrorists. We're just simply migrants." And the guards escorted her outside of that module, and as soon as she was out, they arrived a few minutes later and started torturing the Venezuelans who had yelled those things at Kristi Noem. We also documented that they tortured the Venezuelans after the visit from the International Federation of Red Cross, who arrived to verify the status of these people. And when these people from Red Cross left, they were beaten, tortured, simply for speaking with Red Cross representatives. And we documented cases of beatings and excessive use of force, for example, using rubber bullets against shooting them against the bodies of these Venezuelans. These people organized hunger strikes. Apologies again for the audio quality. Yes, maybe if he gets closer. They organized something called a blood strike, where basically one of them cut his own arm in order to use his blood to drop a poster asking to be set free. And another protest where they threw things at the guards. They were relatively peaceful protests, and they suffered oppressions. They were beaten, and they used non-lethal weapons to punish these people because of these protests. These beatings took place in the hallways of Secot, but also in a space called the quote unquote island, which are 6 cells in this module, which are used for isolation of those who are detained. 2 by 3 meter jail cells where there's literally no access to natural sunlight, little access to clean air, and the people who arrived there were simply to beat them up and to deny without any access to water or meals. That, in general terms, are the cases of torture that we documented. Other cases where people told us that they lost some teeth, their kneecaps were busted open, they had their noses broken, and they suffered a lot because they even were vomiting because of the beatings. All this within a situation where they also suffered constant psychological harassment because they told them that in order to leave Secot, they had to be in a body bag, and they were living in inhumane conditions. They were completely cut off from everybody. They could not contact their relatives or lawyers. The food that they had access to was of very poor quality, and they had very little access to health services. 37 of the 40 people that we interviewed were sick while they were in Secot, and they pretty much had no access to medicine or medical attention, and they didn't have any activity to do during those 4 months that they were detained. They were permanently in their jail cells. There was no access to education or activity, sports, or something else, to the point that, to the degree that some of us told us that the only soap that they had in the jail cell, they made a they made a small like board in the floor, and during breakfast they played a type of checker or chess because that was all they could do during throughout the day. So these people suffered torture, psychological abuse, but they were also treated and mistreated and constantly humiliated during the 4 months that they were detained.
A mí me gustaría
I would like
nada más
to
puntualizar algunas
just
cosas que
just
es
to
importante
touch upon
considerar
a
que
few
estas
things that it's
condiciones
important that we
en las que
consider
estamos
that these
sometidos
conditions that
los venezolanos
the
en el SECOT
Venezuelans were
son
subject to in Secot
consistentes
are
con las condiciones
consistent
que
with the
imponen el
conditions
régimen de
that are
Bukele en el
imposed by
resto de
the
cárceles. Es decir,
Bukele regime in the rest of the other
nosotros,
jails.
como tú lo mencionabas,
We,
Elena,
as you
nos hemos
mentioned,
dedicado a
Elena,
documentar
that
lo que ha
we
sucedido
dedicate
dentro de
that
las cárceles del
we
sistema
worked on
penitenciario.
documenting what happens within the jail
Tuvimos
system.
con este caso de los venezolanos
In
quizá
the
la única
with this
ventana
case with the
la única
Venezuelans, the
ventana para
only
ver qué
window that
ocurre
we
dentro del
unfortunately
SECOT,
had to see what happens in
porque a lo
Secot,
largo de los años que ha
because
durado el régimen de
throughout the
excepción no
years that
habíamos
this state of
podido
exception or state of emergency
informar de
has
una
taken
persona
place,
que haya
we
salido de
haven't
ahí
been
con
able
vida.
to obtain testimony of
Entonces,
somebody who left
este
these
caso
jails
particularmente
still
valioso
alive.
para
So
entender
this case is particularly
que
valuable to
todo
understand
lo que ocurre
that
dentro del sistema
everything that
penitenciario
happens within the jail
parece estar
system
orquestado en ese
seems to
sentido y
be
refleja
orchestrated
en
in that
distintos
sense
centros
and
las mismas
reflects in
condiciones, lo que
different
sugiere
senses
pues
the
que es
same
parte
conditions, which
de una
suggests
estrategia,
that
de un plan
it's part of
organizado de las
a
instancias superiores
organized strategy
del poder.
or plan from the
Al
highest
entender que
spheres
la
of
situación de
power. We
comunicación tiene
understand the
respecto
situation of no
a
communication
las personas en
has an effect on people in the way they deal with being locked up, but it's also a strategy to strip away the protection from the law. They have no access to a legal defense, a lawyer, or a courtroom. And this is particularly severe in the case of Venezuelans. Just like Juan mentioned, it's one of the elements that literally defines a forced disappearance, which is to take away the right to legal defense. We made many applications or requests for access to information, even from the presidency, the Ministry of Foreign Rights, the General Directorate of the Jail Systems, even the Supreme Court, and they all systematically denied giving information regarding these people. Court even didn't want to acknowledge if they had jurisdiction over these people. There was a Salvadorian courtroom surveilling the rights of these people, and they said they were simply incompetent in order to not respond to this request. And the directorate said that it was confidential information, and it was declared confidential for the next 7 years. So even if Cristosal had requested it or the relatives had requested it, they always received the same response. There was no access to information, and they never recognized having control over these people. Another element that we have to highlight is the situation, is the abuse of disciplinary measures and the aggressions within the system as a mechanism to establish control and discipline. We have seen that in multiple jail systems, and Juan mentioned the specific moments when these types of injuries take place. Many of the cases of people who have died that we've identified within the penal system, in particular at the beginning of the state of exception, it began during the first weeks that these people were detained. The beatings that were used in order to welcome these people were used as an instrument in order to people to make them cow down from the very beginning, and it had harmful effects on the health of these people. And this is an element that we've seen reflected in Secot. Finally, I would like to mention that these situations that we've seen and that we've been able to document, thanks to what happened to these Venezuelans in Secot, confirms the idea that the El Salvadorian jail system acts orchestrated under a line or direction. And these are not isolated acts from specific agents. Instead, it's a policy, it's a way to exercise their power, and in particular, in this case, against these people who are detained.
Bueno, vemos como
Well, we see how the authorities in El Salvador were the legal branch. They don't respond to any legal recourses or applications or requests from relatives. I don't know if you can tell us if you attempted any actions in light of any of these regional mechanisms, maybe the International Human Rights Court or the UN agencies, for example, the Universal Human Rights. In particular, because of these human rights violation, what answer did you obtain? Go ahead, Rene. Thank you. There were some international actions. As a matter of fact, there was a joint declaration from different UN offices demanding the release of these people. And because of the work with these relatives, they also began actions in the international agencies, and we are still awaiting the response. There was an intention to ask these international organisms who were in charge of human rights surveillance. Some of them gave quicker responses. However, the positioning of the state maintained in the same status. Despite their pronouncement and declaration, they maintained the same stance. There was no positive response from the state or any change in the condition of these people or any response to these habeas corpus applications. Finally, the people are set free
en lo que se presenta
in
comunicacionalmente como un intercambio
what is
entre unas personas que
known
están
as an
privadas de libertad
exchange between some
en
people who are
Venezuela,
detained in
hasta
Venezuela.
que esas personas son liberadas,
These people are
muchas
set
de ellas
free,
estadounidenses,
many of
muchos de ellos
them
por Estados
American
Unidos,
or
y
with links to the US.
entendemos que todas
And
las personas
we understand that
estadounidenses son
all of these El
eh,
Salvadorians are
enviadas a
sent
Venezuela.
to
Utilizo el término enviadas
Venezuela.
porque
I
no
use the
entiendo que
term
no,
sent
no sabemos
because
si
I
será la hora de una
understand
segunda
we don't
deportación de El
know if it'll be a
Salvador
second
a
deportation
Venezuela o
from
esto
El
cómo
Salvador
ocurrirá.
to Venezuela
Entonces
or
yo
how
quisiera
this happened.
preguntarte,
But I would like to
Juan,
ask
¿qué
you, Juan,
sabemos sobre
what do we know
cuando tú
about
estás documentando
when you were
y cuentas como no solo
documenting
los
and
testimonios
you
de ellos,
tell us
sino
not
que
only
además
their
lo que están
testimony, but
integrando los
also
médicos forenses de que las
what the
lesiones que estas
forensic
personas
doctors
tienen
are
son
documenting
persistentes?
about the
Por lo
injuries of
tanto,
these
son
people are
personas que
consistent with
sufrieron lesiones
torture.
tanto
Thus,
físicas,
these
pero
are
también
people who suffered
psicológicas,
physical
producto de
and
todo lo que estamos
psychological
viendo.
abuse because
¿Cuál
of
es,
everything you're telling us
digamos,
about.
el
What is
tratamiento,
the
tanto
treatment,
psicológico,
whether
psiquiátrico,
psychological
como
or
de salud
psychiatric
física que
treatment
estas
or
personas han
physical health
podido recibir
treatment that
ahora que
these
están
people have been
libres de
able to
Venezuela? ¿Qué
receive
sabemos
now
sobre
that they
eso?
are back in Venezuela?
Qué
What do
bueno
we
que me
know
haces esta
about this?
pregunta.
Well, it's good that you ask us this question.
Como mencionas, estas personas han
As you
sufrido
mentioned,
abusos graves en El
these people
Salvador,
have suffered
físicos, también
severe
psicológicos.
physical and psychological abuse
Lo
in
que
El
más han pedido
Salvador.
ellos desde que han llegado a Venezuela era
And
apoyo psicológico.
what they
Han tenido algunas
most
iniciativas
ask us is to receive psychological
contra
support.
aquellos
There are
humanitarios
some
que necesitan
initiatives
apoyo psicológico
to
las
start
últimas
giving
semanas
this
y días, pero todavía
psychological
hay necesidad
support
de
during this
reglas
last weeks, but there are still severe
para poder
needs
apoyarlos.
in order to support them properly.
Así que si cualquiera en esta llamada tiene interés en tener más información sobre eso,
So if you're interested in receiving more information about this, we'll be in contact because these people need a lot of help, and it's been difficult to channel the funds to them and channel the support from specialists in order to provide the support. It's important to highlight that many of the people that were sent again to Venezuela had left the country fleeing from the persecution from Nicolas Maduro. We know at least 19 cases of people who had suffered abuse or threats from the Venezuelan governments or from criminal groups in Venezuela, and which configures an additional violation to this principle because they were sent to a country where they could suffer abuse as soon as they arrived. They were interrogated by the intelligence system in Venezuela, and many of them have received visits from this intelligence service of Venezuela, and these are intimidatory visits. And we are truly concerned of their security situation. So we are very worried for their psychological situation, but also the security or safety of these people who should not have been sent back to Venezuela, even though we have to admit that we are glad that they're not suffering, continue to suffer the situation to the hell that they suffered in Secot. In other words, the Venezuelan government receives them as heroes in this media circus, but at the same time, they're not providing the psychological support. And on the contrary, what you're describing is more harassment and pressure now that they're back in the country. In other words, the nightmare has not ended. The nightmare for them has not ended. These are people who have suffered human rights violations from some of them from Venezuela, which forced them to flee to the US, then human rights violations from the United States government, then human rights violations from the Salvadorian government, and now they're being intimidated and threatened once again by the Maduro regime. Well, as I mentioned, the report presents these facts very, very well documented and confirmed by additional sources, but the report finalizes with some conclusions and recommendations regarding this. That, of course, are directed to the particular situation of people that are been affected, but at the same time, have this perspective that's very important when it comes to what can be done so that this doesn't happen again. So I would like to begin with Rene and then ask Juan a bit to describe a bit this section regarding conclusions and recommendations that are included in the report. Yes, of course, my pleasure. I think that one of the main elements is the need for reparations for the families to reinstitute those rights that were taken away from them. Something that is mentioned little, and it's very sad for us from El Salvador who have seen it with our own eyes, and now it's being replicated in a larger form, is the impact that these processes of stigmatization and disprestige in people in El Salvador, the use of tags or labels such as gang member, terrorist, has the possibility of ending the civil life of a person, and then they are set free, even if the state admits that these captures were quote unquote errors, and they are set free. But this element of having this stain of being accused as a gang member terrorist from El Salvador, it'll be very difficult for this person to obtain employment. It's sad to see how this has been reflected in a bigger sense, because they've been subject to a stigmatization process that's very deep, where the state of El Salvador and the United States are also participated directly in the in harming the reputation of these people. So it's important to work with these victims to reestablish or the rights of these people, because they've suffered from severe human rights violations. Then I think it's important to work on transparency on the agreements between states. Unfortunately, the details of the agreement between El Salvador and the US have yet to be made public. From what we know, is that they used a large money of taxpayers' money to send these people to the El Salvadorian jail system. And by virtue of this agreement, these severe human rights violations took place. But the details and more specific details or parts of the agreement are still kept secret. And it's sad that they've used this element as an excuse to try to not comply with their obligations in taking care of the victims. It's important that all the people responsible be held accountable because of what happened and the conditions used by both states that led to the severe violations of human rights of these people, whether it's the US because of the illegal deportation actions that have to do with respecting the due process that are still of having their public court trials or appointments, and El Salvador for executing these actions and keeping these people in these forced disappearance situation for such a long period of time, and having directly committed these violations to human rights. And it's important that the people in the United States ensure that the taxpayer is not used to finance severe human rights violations. We've identified that in this case, they've used taxpayer money to finance torture processes outside of their own territory, and to send a message, as I message, a message of fear and hatred against migration. Also, it's important that international community maintains a very close perspective, a close eye or watch on what's happening in El Salvador, because these types of actions are committed only in authoritarian systems that don't have control, democratic control over their actions. And it's dangerous that these types of measures can also be replicated in other parts, or that these types of exercise of power can spread to other parts of the region. It would be very sad that a situation like this one is replicated in another country. And it's particularly sad as residents of El Salvador that our country, which is El Salvador, that depends on its migrants, has participated on this, and they have become people that commit these acts on their own citizens. Thank you, Rene. Juan, right before you participate, I want to mention there's a comment where Leora Hurek shares that the Center for Torture Victims has started providing psychological support to some of the these victims of these
incluye
tortures.
su
And
información y
she
el correo de
includes
ayuda. Solo quiero
her
llamar la
email
atención de
information
personas
there.
que
So I
estén
want to call
participando acá
attention
y
to
que
people that
estén
are
interesados en
participating
informarse
here
más, en ver
and
cómo pueden
want to find
apoyar
out
el
more
trabajo
and see how they
del
can
Centro para las
support the
Víctimas de la
work
Tortura,
of
o
these
también
centers
hacia ese mismo
of
llamado,
torture.
Juan,
I make the
en
same
términos de cómo
call
podemos apoyar. Así
to
que con
how we
con ese
can see how we
prefacio,
can support that.
adelante.
So
Sí,
having
me alegra
prefaced
mucho
that, go ahead.
ese comentario porque
Thank
no
you
quería
for
dar
this
nombres
comment
específicos
because
por
I didn't want to
cuestiones
mention
tema de
specific
seguridad,
names
pero creo que es
because for
una representación de un
security
trabajo importante
reasons, but I think it's an
apoyando
important
a
aspect
estas
of the
víctimas que
work
han sufrido
to
mucho
support
en
these
El
victims
Salvador.
who have suffered a lot in
En
El
cuanto a las
Salvador.
recomendaciones del
When it
informe,
comes to the recommendations of the report,
por supuesto, por parte de Estados Unidos,
of course,
creemos
on the
que
part of the
es
United
necesario un
States,
cambio
we think it's
mayúsculo en cuanto a las políticas
a
migratorias que han
huge
causado graves
changes
violaciones de derechos
required when it
humanos,
comes to
sobre
migration
todo, pero no
policy because of these
únicamente,
human
durante
rights
esta
issues,
administración.
not only not only for
Y
this
con El
administration, not only
Salvador en
during this
particular, tenemos que
administration,
frenar las
and in
deportaciones
relation with El
internacionales de terceros
Salvador, we have
países,
to stop
que este
the
informe se enfoque
deportation
lo
of
suficiente para que no se sigan
nationals
enviando
from third
personas
parties to make sure that
venezolanos o de
people,
cualquier otro país
Venezuelans
a
or
El
from other
Salvador para ser
countries, are
detenidos
sent
porque
to
la
El
situación en las
Salvador
cárceles
because the situation
salvadoreñas
within
es
those
evidencia
El
suficiente para que
Salvadorian
estas
jail
personas pueden
systems
ser
is
torturadas.
terrible, and it's
Creemos
very
que,
obvious that these people will be tortured.
digamos, también
We
hay
think
que
that
volver a proteger
we
los
also
derechos de los
have
venezolanos
to
en los Estados
protect the rights
Unidos,
of the Venezuelans in
básicos
El
de
Salvador and a
protección para estas
basic
personas que están
protection
huyendo de la
measures
justicia y del
for these
terror en
people who
Venezuela.
fleeing
Uno de
from the
las formas de
injustices
protegerse es buscar que
in,
exista algún
in
sistema similar
Venezuela
al
is to
TPS,
reestablish
del cual han
TPS
sido
or other
privados
mechanisms
lamentablemente
similar
600.000
to TPS,
venezolanos
which
desde
unfortunately
esta administración
600,000
y que el
Venezuelans have been
Congreso tuvo un rol
denied TPS during
importante que
this
cumplir
administration,
en relación a violaciones
and
de derechos
there's
humanos,
an
como hemos reportado en
important
este informe,
role
puntualmente con dos temas. Primero,
precisely on two topics.
garantizando
First of all,
mayor rendición de
guarantee
cuentas y
greater
control sobre el uso
accountability
de
and
fondos por
control
parte de la
on the use
administración
of
para
funds
financiar
from
este
the
tipo de violaciones de
administration
derechos
that
humanos.
finance
Como
these
hemos
violations
mencionado,
of
le
human
han
rights.
pagado el gobierno del
As I
Salvador
mentioned,
4,7
they
millones de
paid
dólares
the
para
Salvadoran
detener a estas
government
personas
$4.7
y no
million
ha habido control
to
del Congreso
detain
sobre
these
ese uso
people.
de
There's been no
fondos. Esas
control
son
from
tareas
Congress on the use of these funds.
claramente del
These
Congreso, como lo
are
establece la
tasks
resolución de Estados Unidos, en
corresponding
que el Congreso tiene
clearly
que
to the
ejercer
US
su
Congress,
mandato
so the
establecido en
Congress
la
has to
Resolución de Emergencia
exercise
por
the
Venezuela.
mandate established
Y
in the
también creemos que
Constitution.
cuando cambie el
And we
ambiente
also think
político en el
that when the
Congreso, es
political
importante
environment
que
changes in
se tomen medidas
Congress,
para
it's
investigar
important
estos
to
hechos.
take
Ojalá haya una
measures to
comisión del Congreso para
investigate these
investigar
facts or to create a
estas
commission in
violaciones de derechos
Congress, a
humanos.
committee in
Sabemos,
Congress
como dije
to
al comienzo, que no
investigate these
es
violations. As
ni
I
de,
mentioned
ni
at
de
the
cerca
beginning,
la única
it's
violación de derechos
not
humanos que se ha
even
cometido en contra de
close to
migrantes
being
dentro
the
del año
only
y
violations of
probablemente
human
sea el caso más
rights
extremo.
against migrants
El
throughout the year,
reempleo
but it's probably the
de
most
la
extreme, and it's a
gravísima situación que se
reflection
vive en los estados
of the
Salvador y
severe
Guayaquil.
situation being experienced in El Salvador when
René
it comes to
mencionaba
their
el
rights.
tema de la comunidad
René
internacional. Creo
mentioned
que la
the
comunidad
international
internacional,
community.
los
I think the
organismos internacionales, por
international
ejemplo, tienen un
community
rol
and
muy
civil
grande que
society
cumplir
organizations have a
que
great
aún no han
role
cumplido a
to
cabalidad en
fulfill,
relación
and
a
they
violaciones
haven't
de derechos
fulfilled
humanos
it
en los
when it
Estados
comes
Unidos,
to the
de
human rights
abuso contra
situation in
migrantes,
the
pero
United
también
States, abuse
en
against
cuanto a El
migrants, but
Salvador. El
also
Salvador
when it
merece
comes to
mucha
El
más
Salvador.
atención por
El
parte de la
Salvador
comunidad
requires
internacional
greater
y no
attention from the
juzguen mucho porque se
international
están cometiendo
community,
violaciones
a greater,
sistemáticas de
a
derechos
more
humanos con
firm stance
anterioridad.
because there are systematic
Estamos
violations are
trabajando
taking
para que, por
place,
ejemplo, el
and
Comité
we are
contra la
working so
Tortura
at the
de
Committee
Naciones
Against
Unidas y el
Torture
Consejo de
of
Derechos
the
Humanos de
UN
Ginebra tengan un
and the
escrutinio mucho más
Geneva
serio sobre lo que se
Human
está
Rights
cometiendo.
Council takes a firmer stance against these acts.
Muchas gracias.
Thank
Bueno, yo
you
creo que
very
parece que
much.
hemos
I think
ido
that as
conversando, hemos respondido a la mayoría de las
we've been having this
preguntas.
conversation, we responded to the majority
¿Qué
of the
pasa
questions.
en este
What
momento
happens at this
con
moment
los miles de
with
personas salvadoreñas que
the thousands of
continúan
people from El
privadas de
Salvador
libertad?
who are
Yo
still
quiero cerrar ahí.
detained? I would like to finalize with that. What happens to
La
them?
situación de crisis de derechos humanos en El
The
Salvador continúa.
human rights crisis in El Salvador continues. There are tens of thousands of people who are subject to a legal process that lacks any guarantees when it comes to being cut off from communication and without any effective possibilities to a legal process, and suffering severe aggressions and violations of their human rights in a jail system which has been proven that it's committed these violations and will continue committing them. We've documented cases of people who have died being under the custody of the jail system. We are documenting the severe human rights violations that take place. within the El Salvadorian jail system, and it's very concerning that these measures are worsening. They are continuing with the passage of time, that continue increasing the possibilities and the powers of the executive branch to maintain these people in this under a permanent situation of being of these suffering these aggressions. There it has the civic spaces in El Salvador are shutting down almost completely. They are persecuting these organizations that defend human rights issues. They've shut down spaces. They led to the exile of hundreds of people and captured thousands more. Among these, between these 89 and 90,000 people who are being detained within the jail system, we have to understand that there are land defenders, they are constitutional lawyers, they are political prisoners who are still under the custody of the Salvadorian state with their rights being violated. And it's a situation that we don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, that he has gotten a stronghold on power and he has taken every measure necessary to extend this current situation. So it's important that the international community keeps its eye on what's happening in El Salvador. Thank you very much. Today, on the International Migrants Human Rights Day, we do not want to forget and want to insist on the invaluable contribution of this report and of the work of all of us who work on migration issues, because it's important to remember that state oppression that takes place in El Salvador, it's another factor that continues expelling people from the country, and that the idea that this is a quote-unquote security policy that can be replicated in other countries throughout the region is unfortunately a very dark cloud that's over the region, and that we all have to be very wary of. This is why this report is so valuable. It's not an isolated case. Instead, it's a window into what is happening. I want to finalize by thank you, Latin American Working Group, who accompanied us for this discussion and for carrying out this event. And of course, congratulating and recognizing Cristosal and Human Rights Watch for this valuable work, because we acknowledge it wasn't easy at all to do it, being able to take and corroborate these testimonies in Venezuela. It's very difficult work and very courageous work. So we acknowledge the work that both of you did. Any moments, any opportunity where we're thinking of El Salvador, it's a moment to reflect on what's happening and to reiterate the call for freedom for Ruth Lopez. It's something that pains each and every one of us, and we cannot finalize the year without thinking of all those people who won't have the opportunity of celebrating the holidays with their relatives the way the rest of us can. So we are very, very clear on that. And finally, I want to recognize the work for the Center of the Victims of Torture, this valuable work in accompanying the victims for their recovery after having suffered and having gone through hell, just like the report is titled. Thank you very much to René Valiente and Juan Papier for their very valuable work on this topic. Thank you to each and every one of you for accompanying us today, for taking a moment to think about this, and because we continue working so that this does not happen again. Thank you very much to everybody.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Muy agradecido.
Thank you for the invitation. Grateful. Thank you.